Good morning. It's nice to, I should say, not see all of you. I can't see you, but I can imagine you. And I always wonder, where do you listen? Do you listen in your car? That's where I would be listening, because honestly, the PowerPoints are there also, so you could listen to these and then go back to the PowerPoints. I don't know if this is the end of the semester and the end of the period, and maybe it would have been smart for me to say this at the beginning instead of the end, but I might make another video that says it at the beginning, kind of like how you could use these videos. And you guys can hear me talking to Jason. Jason, you could post this part to the beginning as well as the end if you have like ways to cut it out. So I will just say that these videos correspond with the PowerPoints, and the PowerPoints are also posted as PowerPoints throughout this course. So you could literally listen to all of this in your car and not be watching the video, because clearly you don't want to be watching and driving. Or you could be anywhere else, like have it in your ear pod, or, while you're washing the dishes or whatever, and go back and see the PowerPoints later and just have heard the lecture. Just a thought. I've been listening to a lot of podcasts lately, and I've been thinking podcasting could be a fun next step to my next series of course development. So at any rate, I am going to talk to you today about Gothic art. And so again, we're at the end, and through the semester, my theme has been, we're not always in chronology. So if you read this slide, if we think originally of history, because we're human beings who are ruled by time, although if you recall in the Islamic section, we talked about undoing time by walking backwards around the Kaaba, we do visualize history sort of as a stack of chronological layers or periods, but we really can't define art history in terms of time alone. And in particular, as we move forward into quote unquote the modern era, and there's different definitions for modern era, but in my mind, in some ways, I kind of think of it starting with cannons, they had cannons in the 13th and 14th century is when they really began melting sculptures down for them. That happened with, I know that the Borgia Pope melted down a lot of cannons for one of his papal wars. But at any rate, that's a little bit after the period we're talking about now, but the history of warfare is an interesting one, and it parallels art history in odd ways. Anyway, the term Gothic, the literal meaning of the word is these Germanic tribes. And if you remember back in AD 410, we talked about all these different Goths that were sacking, and they had to move from Rome to Ravenna, back again. They invaded Greece, they invaded Italy, but that really doesn't have anything to do with the origins of Gothic art as we're studying it now. The Gothic era, we actually have a date. It began in 1140 CE with this man named Abbot Suger in France. And really, it lasted 150 years, just a very short time in some places, and then other places over 400 years. And even today, we use the term Gothic. It's a popular cultural term, of course, that probably many of you are familiar with. And that term arose out of 19th century literary conventions. But again, that's a little bit different subject, but connected in a very loose way with Gothic architecture as it appears in 19th century Romantic literature. So during this period, we do see a gradual shift. And in the Romanesque era, we've seen a lot of architecture and architectural sculpture, but the Gothic era, we do begin to see more pictorial work as we get into the end of it, especially what we call the international style. And it really starts setting the base or the root for the early Renaissance. So the age of the cathedrals, which happens in France, from 1150 to 1250, the architecture is dominating then. And So sculpture really began as architectural sculpture, which is something we've seen already in Romanesque art. And after 1200, it becomes independent, and there's a flowering of this sculpture between 12 and 1420. And again, in the mid 14th century, 12th century, in central Italy, and then north of the Alps is the leading art form from 1400 on. So we sort of move from the holistic discipline, if you will, of the cathedral setting, and then later Gothic artists, they're looking more for pictorial effects. But as I've said, we have a date, and that is Abbot Suger. And so in the Ile-de-France, we have this great accuracy, and Gothic architecture really began with Abbot Suger. And then, of course, it moved out from France in different ways. Italians keep the classical form, which they always have, as we've seen. And then in Germany, it's actually really slow to take hold. But then once it does take hold, it endures well into the 16th century and all the way up until the Reformation, and beyond in some instances. So what does it look like? And I know I'm giving you a lot of words and not very many pictures yet, but you know, we have these sort of elegant soaring buildings, a lot of light, colors, and we have this civic light, this life that's starting. They're all moving to cities, and these cities are building these urban cathedrals. So people are seeing this city life, this opportunity. They're moving out of the country, they're getting a job building this cathedral, and then other people, merchants and manufacturers, are all moving around the city to supply goods and services to all of the people that are building these cathedrals. And it is really a way that these towns are growing exponentially and expanding. They actually quarried during this time, during all of the Middle Ages, really, several million tons of stone, if you can imagine this. There were 80 cathedrals built throughout this time period, and then, you know, large churches, tens of thousands of parish churches, they just built. So the churches are dominating their surroundings. They're the center of city life. So everything happens at the church. The market's outside it. You go to church every single day. The crusades are continuing. There's all sorts of elements coming from Byzantine, from Islamic worlds. These pilgrimages are still going on. That began in the Romanesque period. That doesn't discontinue at this time period. But what begins to happen is that monasteries are taking on less important, and urban centers are taking on a greater role. And so we begin these large centers of thinking, of reason, of logic. Universities begin to spring up, and these people begin to write about the writing, about the earlier writing. So scholasticism and invention, and bringing Greek philosophy, Roman philosophy, all of this together with Christianity. Not only that, there's disaster. So we have this unconsummated desire for what one can never have. And a lot of that is really driven by the fact, for example, there's war throughout all this time, there's famine, of course, there's plague. 40% of the population of Europe is depleted during this time period. Just imagine, it's like having a nuclear war. Imagine almost half the people just died, and just imagine just truckloads of dead bodies being driven out of every town, and there's no room to even bury them. It's hard for us to picture that from our perspective. So, of course, after that, that naturally depletes the labor force. So wages rise because there's less people to do the work, and people who've never worked have to work as well. So it's a life-changing thing. 1378 to 1417, we have another schism with two popes, one pope in Avignon, one pope in Rome. They both claim legitimacy. So all of this stuff is going on, and I've given you a link to ideas about this great schism right here. So here's a map, because you know me well enough to know that I love maps. And so we really are going to be concentrating in this area right here. Here's the Ile-de-France right outside of Paris. Okay, So it begins in Paris in the Ile-de-France, eventually becomes this international style. And so we're going to begin it with a study of the cathedral because, as I've said, this is the cornerstone of Gothic art. Everything springs from this. All other arts in the art of the cathedral are included to enhance this religious space. So the stone edifice, everything that it contains within it, including the faithful, including the people inside, are a symbol of God and his creations. So we have four main factors in the emergence of this Gothic style, and I've touched on a lot of it, but I've given you a slide here for bullet points: population explosion, rise of the Capetian monarchy, this alliance that the Capetian monarchy made with church and state, and lastly, about this style, we have a fusion: reason, scholasticism with Thomas Aquinas, and then emotion, which is the mysticism of Abbot Suger. So Suger takes some of these scholastic ideas, it's sort of the two things together. So during this time, Louis VI and VII are the monarchs, and again, they're controlling the Ile-de-France. Louis VII married Eleanor of Aquitaine, the richest queen in Western Europe, so for obvious reasons. And she left Louis. She married Henry Plantagenet, which led to this 100 Years' War, which European history is very interesting, also complicated. So I've given you another link to that, to those of you who are history buffs. But as it affects this, it's good to have a sense of what's going on in the background, because all art, everything in art, architecture is driven by what's happening in the culture of the time. So here's a little bit about Abbot Suger. He's born in 1084, so right at the turn of the century. He was educated together with Louis VI, so they were boyhood friends, and so Suger really became a very close advisor to not only Louis VI, but also Louis VII, who we just talked about. And he's a mediator between the church and the royal family. He was even the regent of France while Louis VII went away on a cruise. And again, this is all very important because Louis VI and Louis VII are both recognizing the importance of this intermingling of church and state, where the power lies. And art, of course, takes money and power to create, especially something like a cathedral. So this is sort of the circumstances in which these cathedrals can be created. So Suger was appointed an abbot of Saint-Denis, it's a monastery, in 1122. It's also where the French royal family is buried. So he rebuilt this center as a spiritual center of France. He was, what, quote unquote, a Renaissance man, even though it's not the Renaissance. And this is the chalice of Abbot Suger. You can see all these classical cartouches in it, and then this beautiful stone that it's solid stone that it's carved from, classical influences in the gold and in its making. So Suger represents mysticism, and the inside of a Gothic cathedral is completely a mystical experience. We touched on this a little bit, if you remember back when we looked at Mozarabic Spain and we looked at that parchment that you could sort of scratch your finger along it and it gave you that astringent smell. Well, this is sort of that, only much more. That's not a very elegant way to say it, but at any rate, so it's an immersion experience, if you will. Kind of like, I don't know, what would be a good modern day analogy? The difference between looking at a picture of something on the internet with a little sound or going into not even virtual reality, if you will, although here it is reality. At any rate, according to Suger, faith is stimulated by body sensations and by emotion. So light symbolizes the experience of the design. It symbolizes God. It bounces off gold objects. And then they have chanting. They have the smell of the incense. They have the tactile sensation of these rich materials, the velvets, the sumptuous materials, along with rough stone. Everything is a completely immersion. Every single sense is set alight. So, and this is funny because he studied what he thought were the works of Saint Denis, although they were really the works of a mystic named Dionysius. But nevertheless, he is inspired by these ideas of emphasis on mathematical harmony. And so he elaborated all of these ideas into a theory, all based on musical ratios. And we saw a little of this, if you remember, in the earlier cathedral with Gregorian chants. But this is much more refined. And so you can begin to see the early ramifications of the Gothic style here in the attachment of these vaulted art, of this vaulting, this rib vaulting onto these columns, and the stained glass in this view of this church. So character, and this is a view of a later cathedral, Chartres. This is not Saint Denis, but this is sort of a slide that'll give you characteristics of the Gothic style. For one thing, support. But if you notice, you see the attachments here at the top of these piers. The walls are perforated to allow more light to enter while the light can get in all three areas. And there's a three-part elevation for verticality. So it's moving the eye right up toward heaven, very elegant lines that are moving you up, and also unity. So the other half of this equation is this man named Thomas Aquinas, who belonged to the Dominican monastic order, and he followed this school of thought we really haven't talked much about yet. It was called scholasticism, which was really the dominant theological school of the medieval period. They're reconciling the ancient Greeks, Aristotle, with Christianity. So Aquinas believed that knowledge has to be obtained through studying all of God's creation, that it isn't just some mystical thing that comes in with no reason. He brings in this element of reason to it. And he concluded that geometric shapes can be found in nature, and so he applied these to architecture. So he found geometric and numerical codes to support this. This is a page from Summa Theologia, which Aquinas wrote right here. So this is the west facade of the Abbey at Saint Denis, which is our first Gothic structure built by Abbot Suger. And Suger brought in masons and sculptors from other regions to build this. So it's a very, very early version. And so this west facade that you see here is the first part completed. And we've seen west works before, but here we're seeing this tripartite elevation, 1, 2, 3, from the body to the tower to the spire. Also, 3 layers in each. There's 3 across, and then each of the 3 sections is also divided in 3 with the rose window at the center. So this is this incarnation of this style. Here is the inside, and so this is the choir of this church, which he's getting this idea from these Roman pilgrimage churches that we studied already. So we have these architecture elements in here. We have ribbed groin vaults and pointed arches. So this becomes a hallmark to the Gothic style, is this development of these pointed arches and pointed arch vaulting, pointed groin vaults, and also wall buttresses and window openings, all started with Romanesque architecture and then get refined. So we have this semicircular sanctuary here, and then it's surrounded by an ambulatory, and then again 7 chapels radiating out from it. And here's a picture of the vaulting. So again, this is your root church. So just to review, if you remember what vaulting is, this is from Roman architecture. So the round arch in this vaulting is displacing almost all of the weight, but when 2 of these barrel vaults intersect, we have what's called a groin vault, which is how they built the Colosseum. And from there, they begin refining this into multiple parted vaults. They refine the materials that they make with it, and then they begin adding buttresses so they can build upward. So this is rib vaulting, which are a form of groin vaults. These ridges or groins sometimes are resting on these curved moldings, which strengthen it. And so over time, of course, they become very increasingly intricate, and the skin of masonry between it gets more and more lightweight. But it does also get to a point of no return as well. So you can see that the rib vault moves the eye up in a different way, that the domical vault with round arches does not have the same vertical thrust that this pointed rib vault does. So now with that behind us, we can look at this apse again, and we can see how this rib vaulting is just the beginning. It's a prototype, if you will. It's a new architecture of space and light based on this kind of skeletal framework. So now we're going to look at Chartres Cathedral. And Chartres Cathedral is sort of our main example, if you will, and it's really reflecting the transition from this experimental 12th century to mature 13th century style. And it was extremely controversial. There was a lot of dissent over whether the taxpayers' money should be spent on building this. And in your book, in page 563, there's more around that. It's a very interesting controversy. So it's really giving us the connection between this medieval scholasticism and architecture. So we've refined this tripartite division. Each part here is divided by 3. There's everywhere you look, each section, there's 3 sections, and then each of the 3 sections, there's another 3 and another 3. The Trinity, God the Son, God the Holy Ghost, and the building itself, as I've said, is symbolizing the faithful. And if you look at the plan of it, you can see this equilateral triangle that shows the 3 points of the outer edges of the buttresses, as well as the keystone of the vault in the nave, 1, 2, 3 up here. And it's full of triangles. If you start making, you can start making equilateral triangles here, here. The number 4 is the material world. 3 and 4 make 7, and then all of the combinations in the groin vaults and the crossings. So it's 3s, 4s, 7s, and 12s. Here's 2 views. It's a really good illustration of the Gothic style because you can clearly see this transition between Saint Denis, which is early Gothic, and we can see some similarities here. And then when we look at the next cathedrals, Rheims and Amiens, that's what we call High Gothic. It's really just this, but taller and narrower. So insides of all of them have this, it's called this tripartite elevation, where there's a pointed arch, triforium gallery, which is the passageway above the nave, and then the clear story where the light passes through the stained glass. And so it all brings the eye upward to heaven. This is a view of the rose window, which is, you can always tell Chartres is a very distinctive rose window. 2 towers and the spires. So Chartres is the only Gothic cathedral that still has almost all of its stained glass. Most of the other ones lost it through various wars, environmental effects, and taking it apart. Most of the stained glass dates between 1210 and 1250, so it's 800 years old, 900. It's been there for 900 years, just imagine. And so there's a lot of scenes, we have no idea what they still mean, maybe records of donations, maybe church propaganda. Remember, the church is the center for all work and life, so people that went to this church would have understood every one of these glass panels. So here's a little detail just to give you an idea. So multiply this by all of the windows in this huge church. All of these little tiny details, some of it's even hand painted to give it the flow of the drapery. So every little tiny piece of glass is set into leaded cames. This is an even closer detail still. So notice the robe on this fellow, and so you can see the cane. So his face has probably been painted on this one piece of glass. These are scenes from the Passion of Christ. 6 roundels is the lancet above the royal portals. So you can see these different scenes from from the Christ on the cross and taking him down. The deposition, crucifixion. And then on the west facade, the rose window shows the Last Judgment. And here's the 4 underneath it. Here's some details of the stained glass construction. So they had, you see the leaded cames in the glass panels, and then around it they had put all of this stonework. Just unbelievable. There's like a netting of stone to hold it all in place. So the windows of the west facade of Chartres under the rose window are the earliest windows. So we have the Passion of Christ, the Childhood of Christ, and the Tree of Jesse, which we have illustrated here. If you remember back, this cult of Mariology is very important. This treatise that was written by Bernard of Clairvaux in the previous century. Here's a detail. So the bottom, we can't see here, but at the bottom, Jesse's wrapped in a blanket. And then at the top, here we have Mary and Jesus, and they're completely surrounded by these, there's Mary, here's Jesus, of course, and they're all surrounded by doves. And then in the borders, there's all these Old Testament prophets. So just an incredible amount of detail in this. This is a good view of the clear story, this topmost zone of the wall with windows in a basilica extending above the aisle roofs. There's your definition. I've given you a slide here, and this is on your quizzes with all the parts of this. So pull up this slide, and this will make it easy for you to do this quiz. It's good for you to know all the names of these because it just makes it so much easier to talk about it. So here's a view of Chartres from the air. So we were standing over here. You can see here's the 2 towers, and this is the Westworks. And so this gives us a good view of these flying buttresses, which are made to counteract the outward thrust of the interior vaults because they transfer all the weight outward and it keeps the church from collapsing inward. So this is a side cutaway view. So here you can see the edge of it. So these all look from the outside, look like skinny, skinny little things. We saw the church from the air in the earlier slide. And here's a cutaway view. And then here's from the inside. If you remember this tripartite elevation, so go back 1, 2, 3 slides if you forgot. And here is the clear story, the Triforium Gallery, and the nave arcade down here. So if you turn this sideways, this buttress is attaching here. This is the roof coming up, you see? And there's the top of the vault. So these are those attachment points at the top of the flying buttress. Look at the stonework, each of these little voussoirs that are all cut into these arches. Everything so carefully cut and placed. Imagine being up here in the building of this cathedral and creating all this stonework. It's just all this masonry. And it's just cut and fitted. So inside the nave, again, the architecture is so easy to see. You can see these connection points right here. So they're using 4-part vaulting, and the connections where the flying buttresses are attached to the roof. So 1, 2, 3, 4 in each vault. So it's, you can almost feel the energy of this. Here's a view of the flying buttresses from outside. Okay, so the architectural sculpture on Chartres, we again have these portals, which we were introduced to in the Romanesque churches, but they're a little bit different. Thematically, they're different, and the sculpture is slightly different. On the right, we have Mary as the throne of wisdom. We have this very meditative Christ in the center. So let's look at some of these figures. So in contrast to the tympanum at Autun with the forbidding Christ and St. Michael weighing the souls and the damned twisting and turning to hell, now we have this serene Christ seated in a full-body mandorla, noble, balanced, controlled. And the archivolts have the 24 elders joined by angels. And instead of souls going down to hell, we've got the 12 apostles, Elijah and Enoch. So it's a very different flavor in this portal. It's a flavor of hope. Here's the west facade. So the jam statues are showing the Old Testament precursors to Christ, kings and queens. And note how they're almost weightless, that their feet are just dangling. They're just floating, this verticality. And they're part of these columns, but separated from it. It's not that they're lifeless, but they're beyond life. Another couple of views of this royal portal. So it's calm and order. Even the face, it just embodies serenity. They're still undercutting under the figures, but rather than emphasizing a forbidding nature, it's emphasizing calm. The prophets and the ancestors, same thing, gestures of benediction. Note that the drapery is very stylized. The figures are narrowed to accommodate the columns, very flat, very little space. We've lost the stubbiness of the earlier medieval and Romanesque era. And he used to have four. The fingers are just gone. It's not that he didn't have them. Now, these are a little bit later, and this is interesting because we're going to see this gradual shift as we get to the cathedral at Rheims in the sculpture. As we move forward in time, more naturalism comes into these figures. The poses relax a little bit, very strong physical presence to these. They're still floating. The feet are still dangling somewhat, but they're a little bit more seated. They're coming away from their columns a little bit more. So here is a comparison for you. So here's the Cathedral of Paris. We didn't look at it, but here's Chartres. We're going to look at Rheims and Amiens. And Beauvais Cathedral was the tallest. It collapsed. So they got to a point where they tried to go too high. It reminds me of Icarus, right? They tried to go too high, and it all just fell down. Okay, so Rheims Cathedral is a good example of what we call high Gothic architecture. So you notice, similar to Chartres, but much more ornate. A lot of frosting on all of these gables, and this increases throughout the Gothic era, and we see it in the painting also when we start looking at people like Duccio and into the early Renaissance painting. In addition, the portals are becoming much deeper. There's this encrustation on the top of them, but we still have these basic elements, this tripartite elevation, 3 parts to this facade, three parts, 1, 2, 3 up, 3 parts across. The towers have gotten shorter and stubbier and then the same height. Pointed arch now is repeated all the way through the top of the 2 towers of the westwork. So inside, again, there's more emphasis on height. But we still have we have the same tripartite elevation, the same emphasis on light. Now, the sculpture at Rheims Cathedral, which is what I really want to focus on here, continues this journey into naturalism. And so these 2 sculptures are located right here in this portal. So this is the Annunciation and Visitation from the central portal from the west facade of Rheims between 1230 and 1255. 2 groups. So one thing we immediately notice is that these two groups of figures are interacting with each other. They're not all just floating independently, staring out into space. They're executed about 100 years later. So Gabriel we have on the very far left, and if you notice, we have this S curve, which you can really see here in this figure, and this S curve becomes a trademark of the French court style. So here is a picture of both Amiens and Rheims, and they are very similar. If you notice, Rheims, these 2 towers are a little bit taller. Amiens has brought the body of the cathedral all the way up into the towers, which helps them gain more height. And we notice all of the buttresses as well have these sort of tower shapes on top of them. So as we move forward in the century, they become increasingly ornate, increasingly sculptural, and both of these cathedrals were built after having been burnt been burnt down. And so the church at both Amiens and Reims took all of their resources to build their cathedrals. And basically everyone was trying to build the next more beautiful, the next taller. They raised funds from all their estates, from trade fairs. Here's the nave in Amiens. And here's the plans of these two cathedrals. So I'm kind of showing them to you together because together with Chartres, these are sort of the three quintessential examples. But Chartres is a good one to unpack because it's really easy to see all the parts clearly. This is the Beau Dieu from the Trumeau on the west facade of Amiens. And again, look how much detailing there is in the drapery here now. He's solidly on his feet. There's weight to this figure. He's holding this book. There's a sense of action here. Now, this church is called the Church of Sainte-Chapelle. It's a really interesting example of stained glass work. It was built to hold the crown of thorns and a piece of the true cross, and the entire church is built of stained glass.